Cheese. The people of Skyrim love cheese. Just check any local establishment and you'll find whole wheels of the stuff dished out to customers. That's so much cheese. But its prevalence among the populace begs a question. Where does all this cheese come from? When I say cheese, I specifically mean these 4 cheeses found within Skyrim. And yes, I know that Elder Scrolls Online gives additional information about Skyrim cheeses. But for this video, we'll only be focusing on cheese-related evidence found within the game of Skyrim itself, which is these 4 cheeses: goat cheese, Adar cheese, mammoth cheese, and one more secret cheese. And so to find out where all this cheese comes from, we need to find the source animal that produces the milk to make all this cheese. Okay, let's start with goat cheese. As the name suggests, goat cheese is likely made from the milk of goats. And so, I went to every farm in Skyrim to count how many goats are providing the people of Skyrim with their abundance of delicious cheese. And then, of course, I made a spreadsheet of every farm or livestock owning property that owned goats. And it turns out that there is a total of 12 goats owned by the local Skyrim populace. However, I do need to mention that there are a couple special case goats where their milk may or may not be harvested for the making of cheese. The first special case is Corpselight Farm. Corpselight, as the name suggests, is a farm. And this can easily be seen with its field full of crops, and its livestock, and its giant grain mill, though they don't seem to grow any grain. You may notice that in this area of their property, there isn't any goat to be seen. However, if you go out in front of their house, there is what seems to be a stray goat wandering around the road. At first, I assumed that maybe this was just by chance a wild goat. So I attacked it to see if the guards would become angry. And sure enough, they did. Which means that this goat is a citizen of the town, or rather, property of one of the people in it. And since Corpselight Farm is right nearby, we'll just assume that it's the property of Corpselight. Though, is this goat milked if it lives in the middle of the road? It seems unlikely that farmers will be able to consistently milk a goat that doesn't live on their farm. And therefore, I'll add it to the list as a goat on a Skyrim farm, but also put a 1 here to indicate that this goat is potentially an unmilkable goat and may not contribute to cheese production. The second special case here is Lilviev family's house. Though this building is labeled as a house on the map, the console labels it as a farm. And the presence of crops, chickens, and a grain mill seem to indicate that they are a farm. And they just happen to also have a goat. Well, kind of. During the day, a boy named Clinton Lelviev walks around the town followed by a goat. Now, obviously, as the boy's name matches that of the farm, Lelviev, he likely belongs to it. And additionally, the goat following him is likely owned by that family. However, if you talk to the boy, he says,
"Are you a soldier?"
"No."
"One day, I'm going to be a soldier."
"Okay."
"Pa says I'm too young to fight in the war."
"Right."
"Have you met Lucky? He's my pet goat, and he helps me patrol the town."
He says Lucky is his pet goat. Now, would you milk your pet? Okay, and the final special case is here at a farm called Cowflop. Now, looking around this farm, you can see that there isn't a single goat in sight, or any cows for that matter. Cowflop? However, if you start the quest A Night to Remember in one of the inns, you'll eventually get to a part where you come to this man, Ennis, at the farm of Cowflop. If you talk to him, he'll claim that you stole Gleda, his prize-winning goat.
"Does the name Gleda ring a bell? The star beauty of my farm?"
Except, what goat? I've scoured your whole farm and you've never had a goat. Where the hell have you been keeping this mysterious goat named Gleda? But sure enough, if you tell him you'll save his goat from the giants, there's Gleda. And there goes Gleda. Oh. So despite Cowflop's apparent lack of goats, and cows, it seems that they actually do own a secret prized goat that they keep somewhere. Which of course does add a goat for their farm, but are they actually able to milk this secret goat if it isn't easily accessible on the farm itself? Probably not. So we'll add another +1 to non-milkable goats. Okay, and with that, we can see that the total amount of non-milkable goats is 3, which means that out of 12 goats owned in Skyrim, only 9 are able to be milked for cheese production. Now, goats aren't the only livestock in Skyrim. It turns out that there are two more animal types commonly kept by farmers. One of which is chickens, which, as none of them can be milked, are irrelevant to cheese production. But the other is cows. And I believe that cows are one of the largest, if not the largest producers of cheese in all of Skyrim. And this brings us to the secret fourth type of cheese I mentioned earlier. Reference to this mysterious cheese can be found within one of Skyrim's many books, called Uncommon Taste. This book lists some recipes the author finds particularly delicious. And one of these recipes, Sunlight Souffle, makes note of a particular ingredient, cow cheese. This suggests that there is a cheese made from cow's milk within Skyrim. However, there is no item called cow cheese found anywhere within the game. So what is this recipe referring to? Well, if we take a look at the cheeses that can be found in Skyrim, they are goat, Adar, and Mammoth. But out of these three, there's only one cheese type that's name doesn't correspond to the animal that produced it, and that is Adar cheese. Where does this cheese come from? Well, as it is used to make Elsewhere fondue, some suspect that it is a cheese native only to Elsewhere, which would mean that it may come from an animal found only in Elsewhere, which might mean... But this is unlikely, as there is such a massive amount of Adar cheese lying around that it must be produced locally. Therefore, there's either a secret Elsewherian milking plant, or Adar cheese is created from one of the animals being raised on Skyrim farms, and chickens can't be milked. So, that just leaves, yes, cows. In my opinion, Adar cheese is likely a product of cow milk. And so, in addition to the goats, I also counted every cow in Skyrim so we can learn how many cows are being used to produce Adar cheese. And in total, I found 13 cows being kept by the Skyrim populace. Much like the goats though, there is a couple things to note about these cows. First is this entry here. One cow comes from the cow sacrificing farmer. Now, what is this? Well, in a random event, you could run into a person named Farmer, leading a cow with strange symbols drawn across its body. If you talk to the farmer, he says that he's going to give this cow as a tribute to a local giant. Now, we have no way of knowing where this farmer man comes from, but we can assume he works some nearby field within Skyrim, as he's trying to appease a local giant population. And therefore, wherever he is, as long as you haven't run into him yet, it can be assumed that he's taking care of and milking his cow to produce some tasty cheese. So I've added this farmer man's cow to the list. And then, once again, we have Cowflop, a real enigma of a farm. But before we take another look at Cowflop, just a reminder, if you want to support this channel, you can join the Patreon, where you can download graphs and art used in the videos, as well as see some Patreon exclusive videos. Yeah, and that's it. Anyway, let's go back to Cowflop. Now, we've already seen that the only livestock actually present on their farm is a couple chickens. However, if you go next door to Frostfruit Inn, you'll find that out front there are two whole cows grazing in a little pen. Now, looking at this, it may be perceived that these cows are owned by the inn and not by Cowflop. However, this may not entirely be the case. I overheard a conversation between Cowflop's two farmers. One of the farmers mentions that he sells cow manure in the city.
We should start selling the soil along with the dung, along with the dung, along with the dung, along with the dung.
This can only be the case if he has a cow to make cow manure, which means that the cows outside Frostfruit Inn might actually be the property of Cowflop, and are therefore milked by Cowflop. The question is though, why would the inn be courteous enough to hold on to Cowflop's cows for them? Well, I think here we can take a look at the owner of the Frostfruit Inn, this Moralki man. As you can see, Moralki is getting a little old, and it's possible that he's beginning to become a little forgetful. Overhearing him talking to his son, Moralki mentions,
"I heard you sneaking around downstairs last night."
Except the Frostfruit Inn doesn't have any sort of basement whatsoever. This might be a hint to Moralki's deteriorating mental state, which would explain why he's constantly sweeping the same exact spot on the floor every couple minutes, and telling me the same thing over and over again.
Wants to be an adventurer. He's a good-natured lad, but he's got no idea how dangerous the world really is.
And so, if Moralki's symptoms are clear to me, then they must be even more obvious to his next-door neighbors over at Cowflop. Perhaps Cowflop's farmers are taking advantage of Moralki's current state of mind by borrowing Moralki's land. and storing the cows from their farm outside the inn. This way, Calflop can have more land to grow crops. And so yes, these cows may seem like they're part of the Frostfruit Inn, but they are likely owned and more importantly, milked by Calflop. Now, after this cow count, we can see that there is actually no unmilkable cows on the properties of Skyrim, which brings us to 13 milkable cows in total, 4 more than the amount of milkable goats. Now that we found the origins for both goat cheese and Adar cheese, we need to look for the producers of mammoth cheese. And, much like goat cheese, the name suggests that it is produced from the milk of mammoths. Unlike the other livestock, mammoths aren't kept on human farms, but instead are herded by giants. And so by visiting all the giants' camps, and with almost no issue whatsoever, I was able to count a total of 14 mammoths. And with no possible reason the mammoths wouldn't be milked, we can assume that all 14 of them are milkable. Great, so the answer of where does all the cheese come from is from the 36 milkable livestock kept across Skyrim. Thinking about it though, 36 total milkable livestock seems kind of low to produce the prevalence of cheese that exists in Skyrim. So this leads me to another question. How much cheese can these livestock actually produce per day? Okay, well to answer this, we need to figure out how much milk each animal produces per day. Unfortunately, Skyrim does not provide us with these numbers. But the livestock of Skyrim are likely based off of real-world animals. And so we can assume that the milk production of the Skyrim animal is similar to the real-world equivalent. Therefore, just like real-world goats, a Skyrim goat likely produces 2 liters of milk per day. Skyrim cows likely produce around 9 liters of milk per day. Mammoths, though, are a little trickier, because the real-world version is kind of hard to milk right now. But we can still use the next best thing, an elephant. And elephants produce about 10 liters of milk per day. So we'll assume that mammoths produce approximately the same amount. Now that we know how much milk the animals produce, we need to know how much of that milk can be turned into cheese. And apparently for every 100 grams of cheese, about 1 liter of milk is required. This means that these Skyrim goats that only produce 2 liters of milk per day can only provide at most 200 grams of cheese per day, assuming none of it is used for any other purposes. Meanwhile, the cow's milk will make 900 grams of cheese per day, and mammoth milk about 1,000 grams of cheese per day. And so here is the gram amount of cheese produced per day in Skyrim. Great. However, showing the amount of cheese produced in a value of grams is a bit difficult to visualize. Why don't we convert the grams into a value that we can better understand? Say, the animal's respective cheese item. To do this though, we first need to know approximately how many grams the cheese items weigh within Skyrim. This means we need to find the cheese's mass. How do we find the mass? Simple. We just use the incredible equation of mass equals volume times density. This means that if we find the volume and density of the cheeses, then we can figure out the mass. Let's get started. Quick side note, cheese, like most items found in Skyrim, have a wide range of sizes which would cause the volume of a cheese to differ depending on which cheese we measure. However, if we take cheese out of our pocket and put it on the ground, it will always be the exact same size. Therefore, we will consider this pocket cheese to be the most common or average size for a cheese. And all our measurements will be based on this pocket cheese. Now, let's get back to finding the volume. For this cheese, we will use the equation to find the volume for a cylinder, because of the cheese's cylindrical shape. That equation is pi times radius squared times height, which means we'll need to actually measure the cheese's height and radius. So in order to do this, I brought a Skyrim cheese model into a 3D editing software to measure its exact height and radius by counting every single pixel. Nah, I'm just kidding. I actually just assumed Skyrim Man's feet to be approximately 26 to 28 centimeters, or the average size of a male human foot, and then compared this foot with the various cheese items to obtain their approximate measurements. To get the radius of the cheese, we need to first measure its diameter, which is the length that goes from one side to the other while also going through its center. And that diameter is about 34 centimeters. And then we can cut the diameter in half to get the radius of 17 centimeters. And now for the height, we'll put the cheese on its side like, say this, and measure this part of the cheese for the height, which is about 22 centimeters. Now that we know the radius and the height, we can use the equation for the volume of a cylinder and get the volume of this goat cheese, which is about 19,974 centimeters cubed. Then we can repeat this process for the Adar cheese as well. Great, now we know the volumes of the full goat and Adar cheese wheels. But what if we also want to show our cheese production in terms of sliced cheese wheels? Or just cheese slices alone? Well, okay, let's see if we can find their volume too. Luckily, finding the volume for the sliced cheese isn't as hard as you might think. It's basically just the same as the original cheese wheel minus the missing slice of cheese. And so all we need to do is find the volume of this missing bit right here. To do this, we'll use the equation to calculate the volume of a pie slice, or as math people like to say, a cylindrical sector, as it's just a sector of a cylinder. The equation for the volume of a cylindrical sector is pi times radius squared times height times this angle, divided by 360. Now, once again, we already know the radius and the height of this slice, as it's the same as the cheese wheel. Our problem is that we need to find this angle here. Now let's do a little trick. We know that the total degrees of any circle, including this tiny circle in the middle, is 360 degrees. And so, what if we cut the cheese into equal pieces that are about the same size as the slice? How many pieces could we cut the cheese into? 1, 2, 3, about 3 total slices. Therefore, we know that the angle for each of these slices is 360 divided by the total number of slices, 3, which is 120 degrees. Therefore, the angle of our missing slice is about 120 degrees. And with that, we can calculate the volume of the missing slice by using the volume equation previously mentioned. Now, we just take the volume of the missing slice and subtract it from the volume of the whole cheese, and we'll get the volume for the sliced goat cheese, which is 13,316 cubic centimeters. Now we can do the same thing to get the volume for the sliced Adar cheese as well. Okay, and now for the individual slices of cheese. Luckily, the Adar slice seems to be about the same size as the missing chunk from the sliced Adar, so we know we already have its volume from when we calculated the segment of a cylinder. However, the slice of goat cheese is a bit smaller than the missing slice we calculated earlier, probably about 4 times smaller. But that just means that we can divide the volume of the missing slice of the sliced cheese by 4, and we get the volume of a single slice of cheese. Great, now we have the volumes for all types of goat cheese and Adar cheese. So finally, we can calculate the volume of the Mammoth cheese. Unfortunately, Mammoth cheese isn't in the shape of a wheel, but in the shape of a bowl. It really sticks in there well, doesn't it? And therefore we need to use a different equation for volume, and that is the equation to calculate the volume in a bowl. Therefore, for this equation we just need to know the radius and height of the bowl, which, after a measurement, we found to be 9 centimeters and 8 centimeters respectively. However, because we are measuring the contents inside the bowl and not just the bowl itself, we are going to measure the height from where the cheese actually starts, and this seems to be about 2 centimeters lower than the top of the bowl, which means 6 centimeters. Then we plug in these volumes to our equation and we find that the volume of the Mammoth cheese is about 876.5 centimeters cubed. Okay, now that we found the volumes for all our cheeses, we need to know their density. And, like most games, we can't weigh the objects to find their density. Additionally, we can't search the density of the objects online because we do not have them in our world. However, what we can do is compare them to other cheeses that we are familiar with and use the densities of those cheeses as a stand-in for the cheeses of Skyrim. First is the goat cheese. Goat cheese looks like a hard yellowish cheese, and looking through the world's cheeses, I came across this cheese called goat Gouda that looks somewhat similar. So it's possible that the density of this goat Gouda is also similar to that of Skyrim's goat cheese. But, I couldn't find the density of goat Gouda online. That's fine because we can find density ourselves. All we need to do is take the original mass equals volume times density equation and switch it around so that density is on the left side, and we get the equation of density equals mass divided by volume. Cool. Then we bought some Gouda and measured its volume and mass to find its density, which we found to be 1.02 grams per centimeters cubed. And it's this value that we will use for the density of our goat cheese. For Adar cheese, we chose to measure a blue cheese because of Adar cheese's soft-looking texture and what looks like moldy blue veins spread across its surface. The density for the blue cheese was 0.98 grams per centimeters cubed. Finally, the Mammoth cheese was the most difficult, as there is no elephant cheese equivalent that currently exists in the world. However, looking at its soup-like appearance, its density is likely similar to that of a very soft and sometimes liquidy cheese, like brie. So we measured the density of brie and found it to be 0.84 grams per centimeters cubed. And so now that we know the densities and volumes of all the cheese, we can use the mass equals volume times density equation to find out the mass of the cheeses in Skyrim. And here they all are in the spreadsheet. Now that we know the mass of the cheeses, we can show the amount of cheese produced by each Skyrim animal per day using their respective cheese items. And so this time, let's start with the mammoth. Assuming that all the mammoth milk is used to make cheese, a mammoth can produce 1,000 grams of cheese per day, or about 1.4 mammoth cheeses per day. That's 511 mammoth cheeses per year. Now let's move on to the cow. The cow produces 900 grams of cheese per day, which in terms of Adar cheese wheels is 0.2 cheese wheels, which means 1/5 of a cheese wheel per day, or 0.23 sliced cheese wheels, or 0.41 slices of cheese per day. That means that in an entire year, a cow can produce a total of 73 wheels of Adar cheese. And now finally for the goat. Well, the goat produces 200 grams of cheese per day, which means that they make a whopping 0.01 wheels of cheese a day. Wow. That could also be represented by 0.01 sliced cheeses, or 0.09 slices of cheese. Therefore, in one whole year, a Skyrim goat only produces 3.65 wheels of cheese. Now we can answer our question. How much cheese is produced in Skyrim per day? Well, once again, we'll start with the mammoth. With 14 milkable mammoths in Skyrim, the total amount of mammoth cheese that can be produced per day is 19.6 mammoth cheeses. Quite a good amount, actually. Now for cows. With 13 milkable cows in Skyrim, the total amount of Adar cheese that can be produced per day is 2.6 wheels. Not a huge amount of cheese, but reasonable. And at long last, we come to our little goat friends. Now, goat cheese is perhaps the most plentiful cheese in Skyrim. You'll find it in almost every inn or home, sometimes even by the stack. That being said, goats are the least plentiful of any farm animal and produce the second least amount of milk after chickens. And so, how much cheese do Skyrim goats produce per day? Well, from these 9 milkable goats in Skyrim, they can produce a total of 0.09 wheels of cheese in a single day. What? 0.9 wheels of cheese per day? That's only 32.85 wheels of cheese in a single year. That's assuming that every drop of milk is used to make cheese. These people are eating these massive chunks of goat cheese every meal. How are these 9 goats able to produce all of this cheese? Why is the least plentiful animal producing the most plentiful food? I just... Over here, we have Lucky, the goat. And he's... What? What happened?